Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. It is Great Decisions. It is Friday afternoon. If you're here for anything other than Great Decisions, you will be tested on it. I'm Tim DeRoche. I'm the Director of Programs at the World Affairs Council. You probably know that. I've been doing this every darn Friday, every darn January, February for a few years now. And it's always great to see you guys back. As per usual, a couple things I would like to announce and talk about. You please join us. Are you all excited about the International Film Festival? Do you have your schedules? Do you have your tickets? We are sponsoring a film. We sponsor a film every year because it's a really, really wonderful way to put the World Affairs Council in front of thousands and thousands of people and push our speaker series. And the film we're sponsoring this year is a stunning Iraqi film. It's actually it's a Swiss production, but it's about a multi-generational Iraqi family. It is shot in 3D. It is called Iraqi Odyssey. February 12th at 7 p.m. It will be shown at the World Trade Center, and if you're a World Affairs Council member, you can get $1 off. So it's just like being a Portland Art Museum member. Alternately, the film is showing Monday the 15th, President's Day, at 12 p.m. at Cinema 21. It is really, really a gorgeous, gorgeous film. And you can get information about that on the Northwest Film Center site, which is nwfilm.org, or pick up one of those schedules, which are all over town. They've got this really fantastic Voodoo Donuts cover. Voodoo did this, did all of these different countries on donuts, and we're trying to get them to make them for us for a reception. So February 12th, that's really fantastic. And we use that, as I said, to promote the speaker series, which I told you I would tell you who the fourth speaker was this week, and I am a liar. So we are working on it. It has been pulling teeth. When that series gets up, it will probably have no teeth left in. No, I'm kidding. It's going to have great teeth in it. We are this close on that fourth person, and you will be so excited you will spin about. And excited today because we have one of our very, very favorite folks, Dr. Thomas Bartlett, who is freshly back from the Middle East. Hopefully he'll tell us about what is freshly going on in the Middle East. The topic today is Middle East alliances, and just to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Tom Bartlett began his career as an advisor for the political and security affairs for the United States Permanent Mission to the UN. He worked back in the old days with Adlai Stevenson and Henry Cabot Lodge, so he is an old school Cold Warrior. He served as president of the American University in Cairo, as president of Colgate University, and then president of the Association of American Universities. He went on to become the chancellor of the state systems of higher ed for Alabama, Oregon, and New York, and he has served as a member and chairman of the U.S.-Japan Foundation. He continues to travel incessantly. What do you go to the Middle East, 3 times a year?
Oh, yeah, at least.
Yeah, easily.
3 or 4.
And is one of our best observers in terms of looking at where we've been, how we got there, where it could be going, and bringing some really, really rich perspective to that. Dr. Bartlett received a BA in political science and international relations at Stanford University, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he earned his MA, and then he went back to Stanford to earn his PhD in political science, and has spent so many winters in Portland now that he has a PhD in the School of Rain and Hard Knocks. So give him a hand.
I think I'm going to change my name.
You're wired up, so you don't need to use this. We use this for the...
Does this work? Oh. I'm an old man, and this kind of technology is still somewhat baffling. I think I'm going to change my name from Tom Bartlett to Tom Former, because everything I've done is what I formerly did. Tim may be sorry he gave me that kind of flowery introduction because of what I'm now going to announce, and that is I'm going to change the subject slightly. I wasn't too sure when I read this subject exactly what it is, but I think this subject referred to some tactical maneuvering that's now going on in the Middle East as alliances of the past begin to break up and shift, all kinds of tactical changes. Those are going to go on in a variety of ways. And unless we're a group of specialists trying to deal with what to do tomorrow, that's not what we should be trying to internalize and think about. We need to look much more at what's going on in the area fundamentally. What are our interests in the area? How do we act in relation to what's really going on and what our interests are? Very fundamental, simple train of thoughts, and that's what I'm going to try to talk about. I'm going to skip off around a variety of topics, hoping that these pieces create a mosaic that has some consistency and meaning, I hope. And I want to try to begin by trying to understand the area. Something of the underlying historical and social processes that are going on. How did the region get to where it is today? The future will begin in that past. And so that's where I think I want to begin. The story for me starts with the hundreds of years of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was an organization of people unlike any of the Western empires or Eastern empires in the Far East, for that matter. It was a intermingling, mixing of populations that had different languages, traditions, religions. It was a way of organizing people who were all intermixed but not nicely arranged geographically in ethnic groups. The Ottoman Empire, if you like, was kind of the umpire and the referee controlling the power that allowed all these groups to intermingle and interact without violence most of the time. Now, all of that collapses at the end of World War I. That's a whole story in itself, but I won't try to tackle it, though I think it's fascinating. Can you hear me all right in the back? Yeah. World War I, collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the colonial powers, particularly Britain, but also France, divide up what each of them wants as part of how it thinks it is going to rule its empire and organize its empire. They do that by creating what are really artificial state boundaries that they think fit into their colonial operations and structures. They use the language of nation states, which is the familiar language of the Western world, but these aren't really nation states that are being created. And from the point of view of the Ottoman experience, they're pretty irrelevant. And I think it's important for us to realize that the boundaries were drawn around Iraq and Syria. Take obvious examples. Turkey. Turkey is bounded by a series of ceasefire lines where the fighting stopped between the British and Ataturk's Ottoman forces. These are all states that aren't nations in the traditional use in the West. All right, Ottoman Empire, colonial, arbitrary creation of states, the end of World War II, decolonization, process that starts soon after the Second World War And you can put a kind of boundary on that process in time in 1960 at the big UN heads of state, General Assembly, which really was pretty much the end of colonialism, and that was true in the old Ottoman territory. So we have these now independent states, free of the colonial powers. They're top-down states that aren't nations. They have the challenge to create institutions beyond the army and the bureaucracy, which is the way they're governed and controlled. Institutions that will somehow diffuse power through the society in all kinds of ways. Those are missing. They also have to evolve, if they are to persist after decolonization, some kind of sense of national identity among its people. Identity, institutions. Now, we in the United States pretty much can't conceive of any other way of organizing people except as nation states. Well, actually, that's not a very old idea if you think of it in historic perspective. And it isn't clear how that's going to function as we go forward in a highly technological, interdependent world. But that's the vocabulary, and those are the concepts that we're used to, that we talk about, and those are the ones that we want to apply in the Middle East. Good luck. Before I talk more about what the United States should be doing, how we should react to what I'm trying to describe, I want to talk about two particular topics: demographics and what I shall call ISIS. You know, it's got three names at least, but we'll call it ISIS because that's easy to say. Demographics. This is a category that you hear references to occasionally, but until very recently, nobody has described it as being very important, and yet it's one of the most determinant elements in the picture of the Middle East and in the future of the Middle East as we go forward. I'm going to start in this topic by talking about Egypt. That's the place I know the best. It's easy for me to talk about, but I'm not going to stop there because it's not just Egypt. This is a regional issue. When Molly and I first got to Egypt with our three little boys in 1963, Egypt had 27 million people. Something shocking was coming into people's attention at that point. It was the national period of the Nasser regime, very top-down, socialist, secular, look to the future kind of regime. Something shocking was coming to their attention. Egypt could no longer feed itself. Egypt, breadbasket of the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, the source of food for the British Army all during the Second World War. That recently. Now, 27 million people. That's about 7 or 8, maybe 10 million more than it can feed. Got to do something. A major population control initiative was put in place. It was run by led by a fellow named Zakaria Mohiuddin, who was in many ways the second leading figure in the country after Nasser. This was serious business because it's a top-down regime, it's made a policy decision, it's facing a problem, it's going to get the job done on the ground. And it was impressive the way it started. Well, then, somewhere on the way to the implementation, there was a thing called the '67 War. One of the two most important change moments in the Arab world, indeed in the Middle East. The '67 War is the pivot point. It was a tragedy from the point of view of Egypt. I can tell you I was there when it was going on, locked up in a hotel while we waited to get out of the country. It was a tragedy for Egypt. And after the shock of it was over and being internalized, just about everything else got washed away for a period of time. And then Nasser died in 1970. Egypt and history moved on. The population program pretty well went away, though the concern about people and food and how to make this thing work has been going on in some fashion ever since. Well, now Egypt, which had 27 million people when we got there, 27, has 90 million people. Cairo, which was a nice little town of 3.7 million people, now has 19 million people. But wait, there's more. 40% of the people in Egypt are 16 years of age or younger. Now, even if they don't have many children per family, the numbers of families that are going to be formed means that the population growth is going to be dramatic in the years immediately ahead, even though the birth rate is falling dramatically, just because there are going to be so many new families. It's called demographic inertia. That is something we can count on, and people who watch these things and think about them think, my gosh, how far away can 150 million people be? And nobody can imagine how that state can function with these kinds of numbers, because the land area isn't growing. It's an old seabed, and the only place you can do things is in the valley and its extrusion into the Mediterranean. Okay, a few more numbers of these kinds around the region, just to let you know that Egypt is not peculiar in this regard. Saudi Arabia, when I first encountered Saudi Arabia at the UN, it was about 1956. We speculated that they had 3.5 million people. The Saudis claimed they had 5 million. 3.5 million was about right. 3.5, 1955. 2015, 31.5 million people. 3.5, 31. Iraq, 1955, 5 million people. Iraq, 2014, 36.6 million people. Iran, not an Arab country, but in the region and in the patterns of the region. 1956, 19 million people, and I think that may be an exaggeration, but that's the number that seems to be official. 19 million. 2014, 80 million. Turkey, even Turkey, 1956, 24.8 million people. 2016, 80 million people. Now, think of the challenge to governments and official agencies of building roads, houses, schools, public services of any kind in economies that are very limited at these kinds of rates of growth of population. You do not understand the full measure of what has been going on and will go on without putting demography into the picture, and I'm emphasizing it not because it's the only factor, but because it's the one that so often gets neglected, because it's not dramatic of the moment. It's not an event. It's not something you can say, yesterday X did Y to Z. It is the water rising, and that water is very powerful indeed. Now I want to talk a little bit about ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call it. Let's call it ISIS, just because it's easy. Well, thank you very much. A terrible mistake, tragic mistake, historic mistake of American foreign policy, the invasion of Iraq. That invasion, through a series of steps and missteps, produced a militant Shiite government eager to get rid of the domination by the Sunni minority that Saddam Hussein had maintained in place for a long time. One of the things that happened, and we played a key part in that, the dissolving of the army, which is largely Sunni, certainly Sunni-led, and a lot of shock and awe for the people who were involved in that Sunni army. That produced this chain of events, and I'm not going to be very accurately analytical about this, descriptive, where after about 2010, the Sunni officer corps ended up taking over what is really ISIS. And that a phenomenon then began to attract people from Syria and other parts of the Muslim world, so that you now have something, and these are the numbers that I get, these kind of things I'm always suspicious of at the detail, 31,000 troops of some sort with ISIS now. They claim 40,000, but I think it's 31,000 number is probably closer. About 20,000 of those are, in some sense, from the Iraqi point of view, foreign. About 3,400 are from the West, or not from Muslim countries. They represent, in many cases, when they are foreigners, they are Sunnis who have been disaffected in the countries to which they have been living. Well, what's the implication for the United States? Well, one thing, if there is to be a fight against ISIS, and I think it's inevitable that there must be, it must be led in front by Muslim countries. The United States can help, and I think we will continue to do as we have so far, continue to help in various power ways, Air Force, Special Forces, limited ways. But this must not be a fight we lead or that is identified with the United States. Were that to happen, it would absolutely feed into the ISIS story that the problems are all the subjection and the power misuse of the West led by the United States. And I hope we have learned that's not a story that we want to feed and encourage. It's also worth noting in passing, incidentally, that if you look at the religious doctrine of ISIS, it's Salafi Wahhabism. Now, what do you know about that? Where did that come from? It came from money from Saudi Arabia. And the chickens are coming home to roost. It will be fascinating to see how this all plays out, but it's important for us to realize what we're dealing with and how important it is that we not be in the position of providing the state-of-the-art frontline military force, because the implications of that are appalling. But let me extend that beyond a little bit beyond ISIS. The United States' role must not be to try to determine the trajectory that the area is going to take in the years ahead, the trajectory that builds on the past that I was describing earlier. We must not think of ourselves as being the force that's going to determine that trajectory. All that would do, if we were to make the mistake, is to be sure that the people involved on the ground unite against us. And they and much of the rest of the world will certainly hold us responsible for the difficulties the region is going to face because of the circumstances of its present and its past. We don't want to be the ones who are responsible for the non-development of the region, which is what could easily transpire if we try to think of this as a force problem. Got to get in there, take over, straighten these people out, and by golly, we can do it. Don't you believe it? We do have some important roles to play. And I begin in the most boring kind of enumeration you can think of. Just happens to be crucial. It's called soft power. Now, what do I mean by soft power? Education, people back and forth. Our people going there, their people coming here. Business, seeking to find areas of common interest beyond just oil, which is increasingly less important from our point of view, but business opportunities. Tourism, when there are areas that become safe, tourism is an important way of connecting with people. I just came back from Morocco. That's why I'm rather obviously in jet lag. It's only 8 time zones. What the heck? Wonderful country to be a tourist. Lots of potential, very comfortable, very different. Still at an early stage of development. Well, there will be other places like that as the years go on, and we need to feel comfortable exploring them. And we will be sure, if we do it right, that people from those areas will come here to explore us and to find out in what ways we are examples that they should follow and learn from, and which ways we aren't. But these kinds of soft power, long-term relationships must be fundamental to our thinking about how we relate to that part of the world. We must be engaged, but not seek to be the power, because we can't and control it. And if we pretend we can and try, we will just get into another mess of the sort that we created in Iraq. Now, I am not talking about the rearranging of alliances and relationships that's now going into the Middle East, which theoretically was my topic. And I say that because I don't think we have an interest in the outcomes of those maneuverings and conflicts, potential fighting. I don't think we have an interest in the outcome of that beyond ISIS, of course. But we could easily, if we aren't careful, be drawn into that kind of process. It's interesting to look at the case of Yemen. This is a pretty good example. Thank heaven we haven't decided that we are going to pick one side or the other in Yemen and employ our force to make that happen. The Yemen story is much too complicated for that, and it isn't in our interest to take the risks and the costs of trying to be the principal power in Yemen, because who's right, who's wrong, what the future is, what the past is very complicated. And we will tend to oversimplify it if we become the principal military factor. For the period ahead, for historical reasons, not because of the talents of the people, I can assure you that, for historical reasons, the Middle East is going to remain a relatively backward part of the world as it goes through the very difficult process of creating societies that fit what I guess I will loosely call the modern world, that leaves behind the Ottoman Empire, that leaves behind the colonial period, that leaves behind the simple top-down military, political, governing structures that prevent, so far, the development of all those diffusions of power in societies that are necessary in a modern state. Even Turkey, which in many ways has a very different trajectory since the Ottoman Empire and is a very different country. Not a country I know well. I've been there, but I don't know it in any confident way. But even Turkey, if you think about it, is caught in this same kind of miasma. What are the boundaries of Turkey? Well, the boundaries of Turkey are ceasefire lines where Ataturk's remnant of the Ottoman forces fought a war with the British, and they finally decided to quit, drew boundaries that were ceasefire lines, Turkey. Well, now, thanks for all kinds of reasons, Turkey has had a very different trajectory since then from the rest of the countries in the region. But even now, Turkey has the problem of the divisions between the western part and the eastern part, the Kurdish problem, which confounds so much of its policy. It has its own version of what other countries in the region are going through. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the present leadership, but that's another story. So what I'm saying is that we should, in conclusion, because I want to let you get at me, what we should be doing, emphasizing soft power, recognizing the struggle that these people are going through, trying to be supportive and engaging, and not try to use power to control what's going to go on. Footnote, ISIS, slightly different. I'm going to stop there. And now I want to make this a dialogue because obviously I enjoy it. Yeah.
So earlier you said that there has to be. Hello? Yeah. Earlier you said there has to be an Arab-led solution.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what end game, what goal? Is it to go back to these artificially determined borders of states? And
Yeah. I don't think that there is a status quo to go back to. Now, that implies that I think what the future should be. Well, I don't know. The obvious example to think about in this context are the Kurds. Can you really imagine the Kurds simply dividing themselves up? They're the most functional ethnic group around right now, and splitting off, and we'll go back to where we were. Not likely. On the other hand, can you really imagine a new Kurdistan breaking off in part from Turkey? The Turks are not too likely to favor that solution, to say the least. Well, are there forms of decentralization, of federalization, that are not simply neat nation-state arrangements that can evolve to fit the particular circumstances of that area of Iraq, Syria, part of Turkey? I don't know. But something different over time is going to evolve. And we shouldn't think we're going to decide what it is. And I guess that's the best I can do. Not very good.
Where do the Persians fit into this equation?
The Iranians?
Yes.
Iran it's such an interesting place. I don't know it well. I've been there, but I don't know it. And I've dealt with Iranians over the years, but only in the side. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that in that region, young Iranians are probably the people most interested in the United States and the West, and most curious about how to bring into their own society many of the aspects. That's the young people. The old people are the people that we have fought, and I want to say more about that. We have fought for generations, and obviously they're hostile, suspicious and hostile. That is to say, there is an unstable future that is ahead of Iran. On the other hand, one should remember plenty of oil, educated, one of the most educated populations in the region, no territorial ambitions. They've got where they want to be, and they've had it a long time. a great deal of sense of pride. And now let me say something about our side of this deal. We've all heard about Premier Mossadegh, haven't we? Well, if we haven't, we should. Because here was the first democratically elected leader in the Middle East. He was overthrown by a coup because he was not prepared to lead his country as a militant part of the anti-Soviet coalition in the Middle East. And he was replaced with our fingerprints all over the game by the Shah, who ended up, from the point of view of most Iranians, not too well. Now, there was also a little war that we've forgotten or ignored between the Iraqis and the Iranians. What do you know? The United States was on the side of Saddam Hussein, encouraged him to fight that war. Probably 1 million people were killed or wounded or harmed physically in Iran. This wonderful picture of Rumsfeld and Cheney sitting in Saddam Hussein's office figuring out how we could support their war against the Iranians. While we forget that, or don't know it by design, Iranians don't. So if we think that we are faced with an aggressive and hostile Iran and we are innocent and aren't those guys bad for picking on poor little us, we need to go back and see that we have been doing things to them as they have been trying to do things to us. And it is in both our interests, overwhelmingly, to get this behind us. And that's why I think it is so encouraging that we've got this nuclear agreement with Iran. Is it perfect? No. Is it the end? No. Does it solve all other problems? Not a bit. But at least we are now, it was in our interest to do it, and we are now getting into an environment where we can talk to each other. One of the most interesting things from my point of view, watching the area, has been that our Secretary of State and their official diplomatic people get together and talk. Seems pretty obvious, but it is a dramatic improvement, and it is a step on which we must build. And by golly, if the next administration gets this wrong, it's going to be tragic, because we've finally gotten to the point where we can leave that history behind, a history which is not in the interest of the Iranians and not in the interest of the United States. And we will have much more impact, put it in another way, on what Iranian policy is and what their actions are if we are in dialogue with them and not simply at swords points. And maybe we've got a possibility of getting beyond that. They did not create Wahhabism and Salafism, and I think we should remember that. I'm sorry, he's got the finger. He's coming back to you next.
Where? Me? My question is, what's the probability that the United States will do the right thing? We have one party that just wants to bomb everybody, and we have the other party that maybe has some rationality. But I mean, to me, this is very scary that we don't understand, that we don't know everything.
Gosh, I hadn't thought about that. That's it. I thought I did, but maybe. Well, I just have to hope that we will not get to the let's bomb them policy in reality. It would be absolute tragedy, and it could be another step along with the invasion of Iraq in the fundamental decline of the United States abroad. Somehow, I just can't believe we're going to get to that point. As I say, I am a big believer that the United States has a lot of potential in soft power. I think we have a lot of interests that are second level in the Middle East, not first level, second level in trying to affect the outcomes. I think the fact that you had the Obama negotiated agreement on nuclear production was accepted finally is an encouraging sign. We have to keep our fingers crossed about this election we've got to get through. I think the American people, it seems to me, instinctively now don't like the idea of our trying to march into the Middle East and straighten them out by force. I know it gets talked about, and there are a significant minority of our people who are quite prepared to see that happen, but I think that's not going to be the way we're going to go. Now, maybe I'm hopelessly optimistic. Well, if I am optimistic, what we're going into is a sustained period of things not being quite right, not being absolutely disastrous, and rocking along while a whole bunch of people begin to have the experience of dealing with creating viable societies where they have not existed in the past. And when I say viable societies, I mean societies that aren't simply organized by military force controlling a bureaucracy and preventing the diffusion of power into the society. When I talk about diffusion of society power, I mean, goodness, school boards, Rotary clubs, you name it, local forms of local government that don't report directly to the ministry of something or other. Boy Scouts, all of these kinds of civil society activities we take for granted, but we do not understand in many cases how much they diffuse power through the society, one little piece at a time. That hasn't happened in the old Ottoman Empire and its subsequent history. And that's got to happen in some way, and we aren't going to force them to do it. And that's the kind of challenge of outlook that we have to deal with.
Saudi Arabia is an historic ally,
Yep.
and it's going through a major leadership change. And part of that change has to do with an emerging conflict with Iran, which we are trying to improve our relationships with. Could you comment upon that interface between Iran and Saudi Arabia, perhaps as it relates to us?
Boy, is that a lose-lose game. Saudi Arabia has its problems that are hard for us to read and to take into account. It also has a younger generation. It also is beginning to have some kinds of fissures in its society between the royal family and other parts of the society. It's also facing the implications of 30 million people and growing, so that even its oil incomes are beginning to look, there are less kind of endless surpluses to pass around for whatever anybody wants to do with it. What I'm just suggesting, because I don't go to Saudi Arabia anymore, unfortunately. I used to enjoy going there. It was fascinating to see what was going on. But I have a sense that this is going to be a society in transition more than it appears to be now and from its past. And we don't know how that's going to come out. We certainly shouldn't get ourselves in the position of lining up behind the Saudis against the Iranians. And I don't see any reason to imagine that we will get behind the Iranians, and I don't think they are really anxious to fight it out with the Saudis. So I think this is a classic case where murkiness and the tolerance for murk is probably part of the challenge we're going to have to deal with in that part of the world. Because, again, the more Saudis, what does Portland State have? 350 Saudi students or something like that? It's a very large number, and it's been going on for 50 years. I think most people in Portland don't even know about what Fred Cox left behind, a faculty member at PSU a long, long time ago, with these connections with that part of the world. Terribly important and interesting. Well, the more of that kind of thing that's going on, people are going to the University of London and Oxford and going into Ivies and University of Illinois and all these places, that is inevitably going to show up as tensions in Saudi Arabia grow. And one of the interesting questions is their recent militant attitude toward Iran, is that a sign of strength or weakness? Of confidence, or a way of deflecting people from domestic problems? As the Arabs would say, maraf sha'eh, I don't know. But it certainly is a way of thinking that we need to keep in mind in an environment where there is no black, white, yes, no. I'm sorry I'm muddy, but that's a muddy situation.
What about Israel and Armenia?
I'm sorry?
What about Israel and Armenia? Do you think that the Middle East is going to provide religious tolerance?
Well, the first thing Israel's got to decide is what kind of a policy it's going to follow. I don't know if you take the New York Times or read the Times, but the Times had a full-page ad in just the last couple of days, put there by a whole bunch of their senior military retired leadership, a whole bunch of their senior intelligence service leadership, all saying we have got to get to a two-stage solution. If we don't get to a two-state solution, we are facing the end of Israel as it was created and always has imagined itself. And I worked with some of the old early Zionists at the UN. Boy, they would not recognize the policies of the present Israeli government, which say biblical Israel all the way to the Jordan River, all the way to Sinai, through Sinai. That cannot produce security for Israel, and it cannot produce policies that the United States should invest in support of Israel. And I don't know quite how that comes out. As far as threats to Israel at the moment, other than its own policies, I don't see them as being very great, because the rest of the region is so involved with other matters. You don't hear much. In fact, there are even occasions when Arab countries or Turkey find themselves kind of lined up with the Israelis on various issues in the Middle East. That's not the center of the action. for Israel. The center of the action is they're figuring out their own policies, whether they're going to abandon or are going to continue to abandon a two-state solution. It has been abandoned by the present government, and you can't figure out a way to work this thing through that doesn't create what I would have thought was a disaster for Israel, never mind what countries on the outside do. Now, I'm being rather blunt and unequivocal, but this is one I watched from the fringes for a long time, and I just throw up my hands because we had a solution to that problem within reach at the end of the Clinton administration, for heaven's sakes. The Arab League passed a resolution in 23 that set the framework for a two-state solution that they were prepared to accept. And here we are where we are. Fortunately, that's a problem I no longer have to think so much about. I'm just trying to figure out how the Egyptians feed 150 million people.
Can you address a comment or two about the Russian intervention, military intervention in the region?
I think that's very much a side game. It's an illustration of Putin's, I don't know how to characterize it, effort to go back to where he grew up in the Soviet Union. The Syrian-Russian relationship is an old one. It's been going on a long time. This is not something that just Putin invented recently to try to create an image. It's been, that has been a particular relationship between the Syrians and the Russians that has survived the end of the Soviet Union into the new era, and I think it's unfortunate. I think it causes a lot of trouble, but I don't see it as more than a side game. That is to say, it is more something related to the circumstances of Russia than it is to the future of the Arab Middle East. The tragedy of Syria is so... I think Molly, if she were up here, she would say probably one of the best, most fascinating trips we ever took was with our Board of Trustees from the American University in Cairo through Syria. Syria is such a fascinating area. It has arbitrary borders, and if you look at its demographic composition, it's about that long, different groups. But there's so much history there. There's so much variety. And to think that they're going through this awful disaster is appalling, and I don't see any end to it. It will, again, these ceasefire negotiations that the UN is starting to conduct, well, let's hope it goes somewhere, because there is no final victory. I mean, there's no immediate victory for anybody. And it's tragic to see what the Alawite leadership has done by hanging on the way they have, but they have a lot at risk too, even though they are a small group, relatively. And I sure don't have an answer. But I think we should not let's worry about Putin in the Ukraine.
The news media has led us for years that the Quran was an intricate part of the trouble between East and West. So my question is, what role does the Quran play in the overall population? And if it's significant, what's happened to the middle Muslims?
The overwhelming numbers of Muslims are not Salafis or Wahhabi. Those are the super conservatives. Religion and culture get all mixed up. You can find in the Quran what you want. Boy, you sure can in the Bible. Just think of what a group who were feeling militant, angry, and deeply religious could bring out of the Bible. Cut off their heads. Those wars, the biblical wars, they killed all the people who lost. You can find what you want in any religious story account, and those can be the best things there are, and they can be the worst things. The overwhelming majority, I think it goes without saying, of Muslims are not supporting ISIS. In fact, I saw a report recently, last day or two, that the Saudis, of all things, are saying they will be sending some troops to fight against ISIS. That's really interesting, and that bears watching. No, I don't think the Quran is the problem. I think the societies, the lack of integrated societies and functioning economies and all these things produce outlooks and disillusionment and bitterness, which causes people then to cloak their feelings by things they can find in the Quran. The Quran, well, that's what I think.
You know, and we could be here all day on this topic. I love this is, and I'm really sorry we can't get to all your questions, but the good news is we have two more great decisions which deal specifically with the region. We will have another of our favorites. We will have Nozat Ottoman talking about the rise of Kurdistan and ISIS on this same series. So hold on to your questions. They're as relevant probably in all of those conversations as they are in this conversation. And I want to thank you all for your questions today. Give Tom Bartlett a big hand.
You must not miss Nozat Othman if you can make it. He really knows what he's talking about.
And join us next week. Angus Duncan, who is the president of the Bonneville Environmental Foundation, will be talking about climate.